if you view our culture as ultimately organic, only the most naive among us fail to grasp that various persons and organizations seek to influence our culture on some level, and many will even agree that sometimes these goals could be dystopian. However, nailing down the exact culprits becomes a much more controversial topic, given the weight of the allegations. Perpetrators of deliberate and vast cultural change inevitably have power over institutions and the ability to shape public opinion through the media.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things that aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Sometimes they even strong-arm the legal system with opportunistic prosecution and corrupt judges. One might even go as far as to side with the quote misattributed to Voltaire that says, "To learn who rules over you, simply find who you are not allowed to criticize," which is a common populist sentiment. Despite the dubious history behind this quote, we can still analyze it on a logical level to see what is true about it, not necessarily to claim it as a universal truth. This statement can in many cases be falsified, simply because there are legitimate scenarios where criticizing a group, person, or etc. may simply get you social resistance, because it comes off as unwarranted or punching down, even if the sentiment behind this is socially engineered. However, there is also the idea that if you can't raise an argument in a society that claims to support freedom of speech, this could be due to the lack of a sufficient opposing argument that will satisfy the masses in their current worldview. This doesn't necessarily make the stated argument true, but it could mean that the argument has some truth in it that the established worldview cannot easily refute. If I say that dolphins are involved in a massive conspiracy to overthrow humanity, or that green spacemen control the president, these accusations wouldn't hold up in a serious debate, so nobody would stop you from saying it. However, if you accuse the CIA of assassinating a politician, that becomes a more credible accusation, since the CIA, as a matter of public record, has at least engaged in assassination on foreign soil. Still, the CIA will weaponize the term conspiracy theorist and lump these more credible claims, which often are confirmed to be true, in with the green spacemen crowd full of, grifters and schizophrenics. A less controversial way to approach these topics may be to speak on what has been openly said, published, and carried out in the public purview. I can tell you Tavistock promotes the gender transitioning of children, because they ran a clinic in England that got in trouble for doing just that. We can look at how a usual suspect, Klaus Schwab, openly flaunts that a fourth industrial revolution is coming, which will controversially include transhumanist ends such as neurotechnological brain enhancements and genetic editing. This according to the WEF Forum website. While Klaus plays at these changes being perilous, the fact that he just accepts them as a coming reality goes to show that this is merely paying lip service. The focus of those like Klaus is more about how these changes will upend the order of society, and less about how they could be morally wrong. The reason that NGOs study these trends is simply so that they can retain power within the new paradigm. This specific coming paradigm is also part of a movement that their social strata pushes for, which is an ever-expanding technocracy. In our quest for understanding these elites, the deeper we dig, the more we find open statements by NGOs, politicians, wealthy tech oligarchs, and popular academics, alluding to Malthusian perspectives amongst the elite. Malthusianism is an ideology that traces back to Thomas Malthus and his theories dating back to the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Merriam-Webster defines Malthusianism as Malthus's theory that population tends to increase at a faster rate than its means of subsistence, and that unless it is checked by a moral restraint or disaster, such as disease, famine, or war, widespread poverty and degradation inevitably result. Downstream of this radical ideology is the perceived need to create more war, disease, or famine in order to combat overpopulation. According to an article in the Scientific American titled, "Why Malthus is Still Wrong," Malthusianism has led, quote, policymakers to embrace social Darwinism and eugenics, the result of which, in extreme cases, are limits on family sizes and even forced sterilization. According to this same article, one example is the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which imposed limits on the scope of Queen Elizabeth I's 1601 English Poor Law, which was originally created to help provide food to the poor. The amendment gutted the charitable law based on Malthusian reasoning that, quote, helping the poor only encourages them to have more children and thereby exacerbate poverty. This ideology severely conflicts with the Christian values of almsgiving and charity, meaning that there is a certain hypocrisy of the head of the English Church supporting Malthusian ethics, though this hypocrisy likely starts with Malthus himself, who was a cleric. It is also suggested that the Irish potato famine of 1840 was in part engineered by Malthusian ethics, with the British viewing the Irish as a lesser people. This article even states that Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, Havelock Ellis, and H.G. Wells supported eugenics as a method of social engineering. While eugenics is associated with the right wing and even the fascists, we see that many eugenicists, such as Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, were and largely still are part of what most consider to be left-wing politics. Thus, this isn't a one-sided issue. Through this article, I also learned of Ronald Bailey's book, The End of Doom, in which Nally claims that Malthusians cannot let go of the simple but clearly wrong idea that human beings are no different than a herd of deer when it comes to reproduction. Essentially, the smartest among us have the ability to solve such issues in a way that doesn't necessarily involve barbarically culling the herd. Now that food scarcity is not an issue in developed nations, one would ask why many elites still cleave to Malthusianism and have even created a neo-Malthusianism. A partial explanation is that these ideas continue to serve the elites, and they have found new ways to carry out this ideology by rebranding it. Unlike China's one-child policy, more covert and less open violent means can be used if necessary. Economic warfare in many cases discourages the raising of large families, and Big Pharma can help promote the widespread use of birth control, even among married couples. Some advertising even states that one should have less kids to save the environment. In many ways, the tension between consumption and austerity are actually two competing angles of cultural engineering, and neither presents a spiritually fulfilling way of life. However, let's look closer as to what drives the more elusive left-wing side of the argument for a brief moment. While many at the time viewed the CIA as key to fighting back communism and Marxism during the Cold War, they are actually well known to have had ties to the Frankfurt School Socialists, and what many now know as cultural Marxism. The disagreement that the Frankfurt School of Socialists appear to have with the communists is of method and not of end goal. Instead of fighting through traditional battles or even proxy wars, the cultural Marxist aims to infiltrate society and take it over by methodically changing the culture. This is perhaps the very aim that drives the market for increased mass cultural engineering in the first place. However, it would be naive to claim that the government solely steers cultural engineering, since the government is merely utilized as one avenue for control. Often, use of the government power will be supplemented with the use of corporate bureaucracy within capitalist societies. I know some people hear the word subversion and they immediately close their ears while shouting hate speech. Subversion, in this case, straightforwardly means taking an organization that is intended to serve the citizenry, or the general population, and using it instead to control and steer said population group for ultimately selfish ends. The greatest trick is that those who do this have convinced themselves thoroughly of their own altruism, emboldened by the aforementioned ideology of Malthusianism that they take to be fact. Science, or rather scientism, often justifies such obviously corrupt elitist worldviews. Now we reach the point where we must enter into the spiritual domain, at least for a little bit, which I understand is divisive for some. However, I simply don't believe you can ignore the overarching satanic plot if you want to understand what sits above and behind all this, and get close to a full picture of the truth. Satanism and satanic ideals persist throughout many organizations and persons mentioned so far, and this programming comes in subtle and not so subtle ways. In terms of subtlety, you have the idea of do as thou wilt, which is plastered throughout advertising and made pervasive in our culture. The idea of lack of accountability and lack of truth, allowing sexual degeneracy, financial crimes, rampant consumption, infanticide, and prolonged states of childhood. It's not even subtle when you hear of declassified CIA documents into how to utilize satanic cults, how to brainwash people with psychedelic drugs, and the connections between those in the CIA and the leaders of cults such as Antoine LaVey. A crucial element in all of this is that Satanism does not view structures of power as something to glorify God and to serve his people, and that is why they view it as something to be subverted and exploited. Satanism ultimately seeks chaotic anarchy, not any sort of merit-based hierarchy. Hierarchy is viewed more as something to steal and then destroy, an idea they share with most of those who claim to be radical atheist Marxists. In the most practical sense, modern Satanism is just the nihilist atheist acknowledging that atheism doesn't exist, and that they do have to serve someone, whether it be Christ or Lucifer. I do have to say that in many cases, agnostics or even atheists may do things that are to the glory of God and goodness, because most retain a conscience, but their ideologies generally lack the power to foster an anchored sense of morality. This ultimately leads to a society overrun by sociopaths, psychopaths, and worst of all, the general nihilism of destruction, as cited by Father Seraphim Rose in his book Nihilism. Nihilism ultimately caused the mass genocides and bloody wars of the 20th century, as well as those even earlier, and this has continued so far into the 21st century. I could sit here and point out a laundry list of specific persons or groups that drive cultural change, but this would not fully address the spiritual issues that ultimately lead to the creation of such villains. However, this does not mean that we let them off the hook entirely. In the Christian-based ethics which I hold, persons are judged based on what they know, but yet mere ignorance of the law is not an excuse, as one must still be repentant. Also, there are specific people guilty of specific crimes, and we should not allow them to claim that they were merely following the tides. To jump to something less serious, one of my favorite quotes is from the comedian Sam Hyde, saying that the world is not dying, it is being killed, and those who are killing it have names and addresses. While obviously there is an element of humor to this, Sam is not actually suggesting to seriously harass people in a way that isn't funny, but the quote also speaks to how those people who make bad, selfish decisions that impact our world live among us and are no better than us. The image of an ivory tower is not exactly accurate here, since these people live in real places like Little St. James, Martha's Vineyard, Washington, D.C., and maybe in Europe they live in cities like Brussels, Geneva, or Strasbourg. Inevitably, the same people who pester you on who composes they will jump to insulting your patriotism, claiming a witch hunt, or alleging harassment when you actually start naming people and organizations throughout modern history. There are certainly many names to be given, such as military-industrial complex titans like Henry Kissinger, rich oligarchs with their own foundations, such as Bill Gates, the Clintons, or George Soros, and others tend to fly under the radar, such as Larry Fink and BlackRock. Quite ironically, sometimes the most staunch defenders of these people and groups are the most underneath their thumb or reliant upon them. A soldier isn't necessarily apt to admit that a war was not for a just cause, or even a lie, though many veterans are waking up to this fact. One who is enslaved by consumption is not going to want to admit that consumerism has destroyed their spiritual life. Most of all, those consumed by an ideology are the most wrapped up in sunk cost fallacy. And yes, they don't want to admit that they wasted most of their precious time and energy striving towards a false ideal, one which its own creators spread cynically.